The cursor blinked. A tiny, relentless pulse on a field of perfect white. Leo watched it, his own breath held in a strange sympathy with its rhythm. The document was titled, but the page was empty. It had been that way for 47 minutes. His head hummed with the storm. 100 opening lines, each one a perfect, gleaming possibility, had marched through his mind and then dissolved into dust. The weight of it all pressed down, the need for it to be profound, for it to be flawless on the very first try. His chest felt tight. The lie of the perfect start had him completely paralyzed, a fly in the amber of his own expectations. A truck rumbled by on the street below. The deep groan of its engine was the exact sound of the server crashing 2 years ago, the one that had erased his entire senior project the night before it was due. The memory was a ghost, a cold hand on his shoulder. It was the reason for all of this. The reason the blinking cursor felt like an accusation. That sound. It pulled him back, not to the frantic typing, not to the hope of the work itself, but to the moment after. The hollow silence in the lecture hall as his professor grimaced, clicking through a blank presentation. The heat in his cheeks, the muffled snickers from the back row. The way he'd mumbled an excuse about a technical error that nobody believed. He had spent 2 years meticulously planning every move, trying to build a fortress against that feeling. But the planning had become the cage. He saw it now, with a painful, sudden clarity. The fear wasn't of the work. It wasn't even of failure itself. It was the echo of that judgment. The silent, smiling verdict from a room full of people. The story he told himself about what that blank screen meant about him. He was exhausted. The cycle was so familiar. Grand plans sketched in notebooks, elaborate outlines that mapped every paragraph, every footnote. But the document stayed blank. The planning was a performance, a dance he did to avoid the real step forward. It was a shield that had become the very thing pinning him down. The shift was quiet, internal. It wasn't a bang, but a settling. A single, simple thought cut through the noise. You don't need the perfect plan. You just need motion. Any motion. The goal wasn't to build a masterpiece in one breath. The goal was to break the inertia. His hand moved, not to the keyboard, but to the mouse. He guided the cursor, no longer a taunt. Just a tool, to the top right corner of the planning document. He clicked the X. The computer asked if he wanted to save. He clicked, "Don't save." The screen went blank, but this emptiness felt different. It was a cleared space. It was the first small choice. He opened a new document. The white expanse returned, but now it felt like a challenge, not a judgment. The cursor blinked, patient. The old instinct to plan, to outline, to build a scaffold for perfection, rose up like a phantom limb. He felt the pull to open another browser tab, to search for the perfect first sentence. But that was the old dance. Instead, he set a timer on his phone. 5 minutes. The idea was simple. Not to write something good. Just to write something. To give his hands a job that was smaller than the storm in his head. He placed his fingers on the keyboard, the plastic cool and unfamiliar. The first sentence was terrible. He wrote about the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from his window. It was cliché. The prose was clumsy. But he did not stop. He did not hit backspace. He simply let the words fall onto the page, ugly and unformed. He described the grain of the wood on his desk. The sound of his own breathing. He gave the internal critic no room to speak by refusing to judge the work as it was being born. He just kept the promise to his hands. Move. The timer buzzed. He stopped. He had written 3 short paragraphs of nonsense. But a strange thing had happened. The tightness in his chest had loosened, just a little. The humming in his head had quieted to a whisper. The act of doing, however imperfect, had siphoned the energy away from the fear. The storm hadn't vanished, but he had given it a simpler, physical task to focus on. This was the second small choice. He looked at the bad sentence about the dust motes. Every fiber of his being screamed to delete it, to erase the evidence of this clumsy attempt. It felt like a stain on the purity of the blank page. But he left it. He refused to edit. He saw the urge to perfect as the same beast as the urge to not start. Both were ways to avoid moving forward. Leaving the imperfect words there was an act of defiance. It was a declaration that progress, not perfection, was the goal. He set the timer again. 5 more minutes. This time, he wrote a disconnected thought about the memory of the server crash. He didn't try to connect it to the dust motes. He didn't try to make it art. He just described the cold feeling in his stomach, the way the classroom air had felt thick and heavy. It was another small, isolated block of text. Another small victory. He did it a third time. And a fourth. Each 5-minute sprint was like a single, steady breath. In for the commitment, out with a small batch of words. He wasn't building a cathedral. He was laying bricks. And with each brick, the weight of the empty page lessened. The document was no longer a pristine, intimidating void. It was becoming a workshop, a space filled with raw material. The process itself, the simple, timed action, was becoming a container for his anxiety. The mind's storm, when given the simple, rhythmic job of observing and typing, began to settle. The chaos found a steady pace. The momentum was a subtle shift. It wasn't a sudden rush of inspiration. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of the work beginning to pull him forward, instead of him having to push against its immense weight. Around the 7th 5-minute block, he noticed he was no longer watching the timer with dread. He was starting to get curious about what the next thought would be. The forced action was giving way to a genuine, tentative engagement. He was in the work, not just performing at its edges. The final timer of his session buzzed, and the silence that rushed in was louder than before. He had been in the flow of the small actions, and the stopping felt abrupt, like a needle lifted from a record. Instantly, the critical voice returned, and it was no longer a whisper. It was a shout. It seized on the disconnected paragraphs. "What is this?" it roared. "This isn't a document. It's a junk drawer. A collection of scraps. You've just made a mess of a perfectly good blank page." The words he had written moments before, which felt like small victories, now looked like a gallery of his own inadequacy. The sentence about the dust motes was embarrassingly sentimental. The description of the server crash was self-pitying. The temptation was overwhelming. Select all, delete. Wipe the slate clean. Return to the safety of zero, where the potential for greatness was still intact, unlike the reality of this mediocre attempt. This was the crisis point. The moment where every previous attempt had unraveled. The moment where the fear, having been momentarily quieted by action, rallied its forces for a final, decisive attack. His finger hovered over the keyboard, poised to execute the command that would erase the evidence of his effort and return him to the familiar paralysis. But then he made the fourth small choice. Instead of deleting, he stood up. He pushed his chair back from the desk. He turned his back on the screen. It was a physical refusal to engage with the critic. He walked to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and drank it slowly, looking out the window at the same street where the truck had passed. He was creating distance. Not from the work, but from the immediate, emotional reaction to the work. He took a deep breath, 4 counts in, held for 2, and let it out for 6. The air felt cool. He did it again. He wasn't trying to stop the critical thoughts. He was just giving his body a different job. He was letting the storm rage on the screen while he stood in the quiet of the kitchen. The physical space between him and the document became a metaphor for a mental space. The work was over there. He was over here. It could be examined from a distance, not consumed by it. When he returned to his desk 5 minutes later, the document was still a mess. But his perspective had shifted. The words were no longer an indictment. They were just material. Like lumps of clay on a potter's wheel. They were messy, but they had potential. They were something to work with, not something to be ashamed of. He saw that the fear wasn't a monster to be slain. It was a habit, a deeply ingrained pattern of response. And the small choices, the timer, the refusal to edit, the physical walk, were how he practiced a new habit. The realization was quiet but profound. Starting wasn't a single, heroic leap. It was a skill. And like any skill, it was built through repetition. It was built by making the small choice, again and again, to take the imperfect action instead of succumbing to the perfect plan. The fear might always return when the timer stopped. But now he had a practice for when it did. He had a small, steady way to meet it. Leo returned to the document. The fear was still there, a faint hum in the background, but it was no longer in control. He understood now. The single small choice was the only one that mattered. Not the grand plan, not the perfect opening, but the next small, manageable action. The work began to flow from a place of quiet acceptance, not frantic perfectionism. The document was no longer blank, filled with imperfect but real progress. I encourage anyone feeling stuck to make their own small choice today. Remember, every journey begins with that first, steady step. Subscribe for more stories on finding your rhythm.